Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of EUROPAST Podcast. I'm Viktorija Rimaitė-Beržiūnienė, and I will be moderating today's podcast with Professor Maria Mälksoo. Maria Mälksoo is a professor of the University of Copenhagen, whose research focuses on critical security studies, ontological security, securitization of historical memory, political anthropology, and the political practice of deterrence centered on NATO's eastern flank. Professor Mälksoo is the principal investigator of the European Research Council's Consolidator Grant Ritual Deterrence. She is also the principal investigator of the University of Copenhagen team in the Volkswagen Foundation-supported Democracy Consortium. In addition, she is the author and editor of several well-known books, including the most recent handbook on the politics of memory. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Maria, and thank you so much for joining us today. The EUROPAST podcasts focus on complicated spaces of public memory. So, Professor, according to you, what are the most complicated spaces of memory or the most complex memory issues in Europe today?
Thank you, first of all, Viktorija, for the kind invitation and for having me in this podcast. I guess this is a question that very much, the answer to which very much depends on who is actually addressing that question, because memory as identity tends to be one of these things that we somehow relate to personally. So I don't think there is a universal answer in that sense, which would be able to list all these complexities according to some agreed criteria, to each their own, so to speak. What seems to be the most burning issue for us is not necessarily the most burning issue for the others. So there are still all these sort of layered, local, sometimes bilateral, sometimes regional issues. And of course, Eastern Europe is not short of those issues. And then there is something that I think has become again more compelling than it was maybe for some time in relations between, broadly speaking, the East and West of Europe. The memories of the lessons of the Second World War as they have resurfaced in the context of the current war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, and that we are all in one way or the other involved in, invested in emotionally, practically, materially. So I think this is where we still see that it's not only for the current regime in Russia, for whom, the legacy of the Second World War, for instance, when it comes to, what is allowed for the victor of the war compared to the others, is still a very important thing, because in a way this very different lessons of the war as they have been internalized in the East and West of Europe have also been very visible in the context of some of the very fundamental discussions that we have had about, what is this current war about actually, and how should we respond to it? And that pertains to both, the issues of Russian accountability, for instance, as well as, of course, the issues of how do you deal with the aggressor, because we remember from the beginning of the Second World War how there was this fundamental mood for appeasement in the hope that this will somehow blow over and will remain local. And I guess one of these distinct messages that Eastern Europeans, such as us in the Baltic states, have picked up compared to many in the Western Europe is that in case it will blow over for the rest, it certainly will not blow over for us. So there are, the divergences that are again there. But I think maybe what we also see, and this is one of these issues that increasingly scholars have been addressing in also the broader Central European context in light of these certain populist tendencies or tendencies of illiberalism, is the rather frightening or at least, warning appearance or emergence of what we can call illiberal memory politics, which unfortunately is not only something that we can see in the most flagrant way in the Russian Federation, but also what we have seen, for instance, in Poland and in Hungary.
Now you are referring to the practical aspect of memory, and as well in your researches, you analyze the practical aspect of constitutive events of past and memory, linking it to ontological security or insecurity and international relations. So from a practical and academic perspective, why are memory and past so important?
Mm-hmm. I think, again, because of this obvious analogy, at least it is obvious from the ontological security theory perspective, which basically suggests that just as individuals need a consistent sense of self or a continuous sense of self in order to feel secure about themselves and about their place in the world, the same applies effectively to political collectives. And from this perspective, it is only natural that, when we talk about continuity, when we talk about a certain, consistency of the self, we are also talking about the past, because this is part of that self, a very important and fundamental part. Now, how we deal with these parts, both as individuals and as collectives or as political communities, of course, by and large, I think you could say that it can take two fundamental forms, right? You can be sort of obsessively revising your past in order to fit your preferred or current self-image, and hence also seek to control it in a way that it would be more fitting and more somehow organically like a puzzle piece in your contemporary self-understanding and also self-projection and self-narrative vis-a-vis the world. Or you can be sort of more or less reflective about it. And again, when we come back to this issue of how, illiberal regimes and political systems compared to liberal ones tend to approach the issue, basically follows this pattern. It's either, seeking what I've previously called mnemonic security or a security of memory in the sense of trying to somehow order the past and to mold it into a more orderly story than it really was, because the past, just as the present, is never very, only neat, right? There are all sorts of ruptures, and obviously all sorts of ruptures in this corner of the world we are speaking from. And also it's not necessarily very clean cut in terms of, these are the bad ones and these are the good ones. Basically, there are episodes of each kind in every nation's autobiography. The question is about proportions, right? Some are, more of the perpetrator's camp, if you will, and some are more of the victim's camp, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it is important because somehow states, if we talk about states, but perhaps more generally, political communities need some sort of a story of the self, right? Some scholars would call it a state story. In fact, some others would call it state autobiography. But it is something that, to various degrees, all states are, of course, narrating and doing and writing into their history books and performing in their museums and commemorative practices and so on and so forth. But some are doing it much more sort of controllingly than others, right? Some are, you could say, obsessively guarding a state story that is actually an instance of cherry picking, that is actually very selective, and that is not only prescribing a preferred version, but also distinctly proscribing that, this way of remembrance is something that we will not allow.
The past memory and history are inseparable from the memory laws that have created some resonance in Eastern and Central Europe. In your research, you talk a lot about memory laws in Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. How significant and dangerous are they, and how does the legal regulation of memory relate to the domestic and international politics?
That is one very big question, and there is also an emerging sort of subfield of scholarship that is both in the fields of law and society, but also international relations, that explicitly focuses on the study of memory laws. So for the listeners of this podcast, I would recommend a sort of path-paving book by two of my good colleagues in this Memocracy project, Ulajislav Belavuzau and Alexandra Glishinska-Krabias, who edited this volume on law and memory back in 2017, I believe, which is, showing us that this is a pretty global phenomenon, actually, to at least in some shape and form, to seek to regulate legally the historical memory or the public memory, the public remembrance of a community. Now, in Eastern Europe, what we have seen perhaps most intensely in the recent decade has been, on the one hand, the sort of almost like competitive legalization of certain state stories. And of course, Russia has been the outstanding exemplar in that sense, because it has been most perhaps pushy in terms of not only defining the state story for itself, but also doing it in a way that seeks to speak to a much broader community than the current boundaries of the Russian Federation are. So in that sense, there is the immediate international implication already there, because if Russia is talking about in its memory laws that it has adopted, ever since 2014, if it's talking about guarding a particular legacy of the Second World War and, how the Russian role and the role of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War can or cannot be remembered, then it's not obviously delimiting itself only to the modern Russian territory. It's also speaking to, the broader former Soviet space, but also beyond, because now in light of this most recent phase of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, what has been adopted in Russia is also this legislation which effectively says that you cannot in any way compare or suggest that there was something so comparably criminal in the legacy and deeds of the USSR. Or you can't put the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in that sense, in the same sentence or put them on par. I can't recall the exact wording right now in the heat of the moment. But basically, this legislation is a good instance of how Russia is speaking, more or less explicitly via this legislation to the likes of the European Parliament that have actually, in light of this recent anniversary of the end of the Second World War, actually condemned in the same breath the two totalitarian regimes, the Nazi German and the USSR, the Soviet communist one. So it is sort of, having not only international targets implicitly or explicitly, but in a way it's also, sometimes more than others reaching explicitly out to these targets. For instance, Russia has considered it legitimate to begin criminal proceedings if the Czech Republic, if and when the Czech Republic, removes or repositions a particular Soviet monument in the city of Prague. How should that be the business of another state? Is an interesting question here. But it also, I guess, shows us again how this memory business is so fundamentally tied to the polity's vision of its actual boundaries. So in that sense, you could say that these memory laws, in Russia's case, also do the political work of signaling and actually trying to redefine where these boundaries should be. Where is the boundary of Russia's legitimate authority to order how we remember these key events of the Second World War, for instance, or the key events of the 20th century, more generally, key periods? Obviously, as I said, it's in a way a global phenomenon, only that, we could also say that these memory laws can be more or less benign. I mean, we've had an example of legalizing memory, several examples. Also in Poland, there was this attempt to introduce also criminal punishments in the framework of the so-called Holocaust complicity denial law, which now is reduced to a civil punishment, but this in and of itself is an unfortunate example of how effectively states or regimes can seek to beautify the past, whitewash certain episodes which they would prefer not to remember. Now, we can enter all sorts of semantical debates there, but effectively in the Polish case, it boiled down to the attempt to protect the memory of the Poles as, only freedom fighters and victims of the two totalitarian machines, whilst, putting aside, covering up the much less benign and pleasant memory of the fact that the Poles participated in the killing of their Jewish neighbors. Now, one can obviously understand, which was very much, I think, the original trigger of this legislation, that it was, from the Polish perspective, particularly wounding to hear in the international discussions the trope of the Polish death camps, because there was no sovereign Poland to speak of at the time. But then again, the irony of this legalization of the memory is that once, the law came about, there was not even anymore the mention of this issue that the whole debate supposedly had started from. So there is this issue, I guess each country has a certain key issue that animates them both. But I guess, even if they talk about different matters and the scale is very different, I guess a certain pattern of commonality that we can identify here is something that we can sort of talk or describe as militant democracy, right? So, just as in case of militant democracy, democracy somehow introduce certain modes of controlling their enemies which might come at the price of actually going against the grain of their very fundamental democratic principles. In case of militant democracy, it's not anymore about defending, democracy as the regime and as the way of living together and doing business together, but actually defining something much more nebulous and much more politically contested, such as, the idea of the state or the good name of the state or our honor. So, in different ways, sadly, in terms of the tactics, there are certain similarities between, the Russian way of legalizing and also, this Polish memory law. Now, Ukrainian case is, of course, yet a distinct case, because this is also something we have to very much view in light of the broader process of, Ukraine's political becoming of something distinct. It's sort of, decolonizing process, its emancipation process politically and also mnemonically. It has been a sort of scattered process if you look at the whole post-Soviet period, and there are lots of interesting scholars who have written extensively about it. So, maybe we don't go into this now, but I guess when we look at this, one of the most internationally perhaps attention-deserved packages of Ukrainian memory laws, this so-called decommunization package, which was introduced very much at the heels of the sort of Maidan revolution, post Crimea, and then ongoing war and Russian engagement in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. This is also the context we should not forget when we actually try to wrap our heads around what are these decommunization laws trying to do. So, you can always debate these things from the perspective of what would be the perfect way of doing the stuff, but it's also not happening in the hermetically sealed space of its own. It's intertwined with the political realities and dynamics of the time.
Very interesting. And in my opinion, it shows very well that memory is related not only with the past, but with present and future as well.
Fundamentally so, and that's obviously the gist of memory politics, because the past is somehow becoming then, not just a place you would draw inspiration from and build this ontological continuity with, but obviously it also becomes a resource that you can, mobilize, you can tap into, and the way, again, both individuals and collectives tend to do it is, of course, from the perspective of the present, what we can do, how does it address our concerns now and how we can use it in order to shape the future.
Maria, as a researcher, you are very productive. So what motivates you in your researches?
Well, I mean, it's I think it's always relative. The productivity, but thank you. It's I think it's simply a way of life. I mean, this is scholarship in that sense is a vocation. You just do something that somehow is of concern to you, and perhaps also to the political communities you identify with. So there is some sort of broader resonance to these issues. For me, it has always been important somehow to have this dimension to my research, that it's not just an abstract glass bead game in that sense, but I guess in that sense I would have never made a very good political theorist because I need this sense of embeddedness in a way, and maybe it is very presentist because I also think I in a way think back from the moment we are currently. But then again, we are the children of our times, and it is perhaps differently important to different people to be present in the times we are actually living in. It is important to me to somehow make sense of that time.
So let's continue with security issues. In your latest research, you put forward a ritual approach to deterrence. Could you please introduce this concept in more detail?
Happily. So, I mean, that, of course, would necessitate a very long expose into what is ritual. And I think for that we would need, a series with series of conversations with, religious studies scholars, with anthropologists. They don't also always see eye to an eye on the issue, and ditto in social theory. So there are different approaches to what ritual even means, right? But I think, we can find a certain common ground in terms of identifying ritual features, ritual-like practices. And for me, deterrence is one of these international practices that very evidently, perhaps most evidently, out of all, has the quality of a ritualized practice. Because not only is it a pretty conventionalized practice, it also needs to be performed. There is a certain historically developed canon, a set of agreements, which of course is evolving and is not, something that is only set in stone, but generally there is a sense that is sort of intersubjectively shared between the practitioners of deterrence about what makes for working or credible or strong deterrence and what makes for a failing deterrence. Because the problem is that it is actually difficult to tell whether deterrence has done its job in the sense of dissuading someone from, taking a particular course of action, or it was maybe something entirely else that ended up at least contributing to this. So it is one of these slightly ephemeral international practices that is, however, very important. And the ritual part or the acknowledgement of the ritual features and functions of deterrence precisely tries to get into these other roles that deterrence plays for political communities who practice it, because it's not just about, strategic signaling and strategic interaction and communication. It's fundamentally symbolic as well. So the interesting bit is how these two threads come together, how they support each other, how they inform each other, and what else is the practice of deterrence then doing? I mean, for instance, if we have the nuclear weapons for quite some decades now in the world, they are not going away. For whether we might want it or not, they can't be in that sense uninvented. So in a way, all this machinery, all these coping mechanisms that states have invented in order to manage the very fact that such weapons are there, is also observable as a sort of coping mechanism of sorts. Because in a way, if you think about it pretty seriously, then, the prospect is pretty bad, right? Should any one of the nuclear weapons holding states use them. So in a way, also, I guess you can see it particularly in the context of the sort of adjacent practice of deterrence, which is arms control, which is another very, very ritualized practice in a way, another practice that effectively also tries to mitigate the fear of the very genie that actually is not that controllable, that perhaps traditional theory of nuclear deterrence tries to convince us about. So ritual deterrence in that sense looks into how communities deal with this sense of uncontrollability, how they seek to establish control, how they seek to actually make their deterrence messaging and moves credible, because this is not somehow automatically a given by capabilities only, or just, I'll show you my weapon and now you see, if I simplify crudely. So that's the sort of the social stuff that surrounds deterrence interactions is what this notion is trying to get at.
So it's related to social constructivism, yes?
In that sense, of course, it sort of stems from this ground. I mean, deterrence is also, and the credibility of deterrence is what states or the leaders make of it, because eventually, as earlier, more sort of psychological theory-leaning deterrence scholars have already for some decades studied, obviously the quality of deterrence remains in the eye of the one that you seek to deter, because eventually it is the decision of the antagonist whether or not this signal that you try to send out is taken to be convincing enough. And, interestingly, and this is something we observe with a colleague in a soon forthcoming new article. I mean, we are used to associate deterrence with this, realm of traditional security politics, but actually we can also take this notion into the context of memory politics, and we can talk about memory political deterrence, which happens, among other things, via these legal means, memory laws, which can also be read as performative acts of threatening. Particularly, again, in Russia's case, I mean, this is sort of the repertoire that Russia has very much used vis-a-vis its former Soviet subjugates and broader Central and East European neighbors. So, there is also the similar dynamic, in a way, that you can observe in that realm. And even if it is less, existential in the survival terms compared to nuclear deterrence, it's not necessarily less existential in ontological security terms.
If I understand correctly, the post-colonial moment you are proposing in Russia's war against Ukraine is also linked to memory, history, or even to a certain extent historically determined.
Yeah, that's a long and complex discussion, and of course. If you let the genie of post-colonialism and decolonization out of the bottle, and if you converse to humanities people and social science people, you get also very different takes on whether this is a good idea or what is your base definition, and so on and so forth. So my sort of context in that sense is yes, sympathetic to observing that, fundamentally what we see is a very sort of standard imperial logic of action on the Russian part. And in that sense, a particular post-colonial condition that is there for Ukraine, that is currently, you could say, struggling in order not to be recolonized in the first instance, in order not to be, actually deleted. That would be the Russian understanding of what denazification means in this context, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation, or the denial of its existence. But there is also the post-colonial moment in the sense of how we should perhaps not least in light of this war, think about the region as the whole, right? The Eastern European region as the whole. There have been extensive debates about how, regardless of the, collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of this period, in a way, the region has still been very much studied, politically viewed, and approached, either from the Russia-dominated lens or from the political sensibility, Russia first, and then these little ones, as the French President Sarkozy, so infamously, former president, put it. So it's also about sort of, in a way, slightly pushing the mirror to, in the context of the political discussions about what we've seen, when the war particularly unfolded after 22, about, who actually has the right to what kind of sovereignty, or who should have limited sovereignty effectively, as, was very much the vibe politically, but also in academic quarters. So it's about sort of forcing the mirror in that sense to the face of those in the West who would think that this is still a legitimate way of thinking. But also it is a way to sort of maybe disturb this practice that actually has been structuring much of the research and knowledge production about the region in the post-Cold War period. If you think of the research centers, when they have been area studies centric, they have really been Russia, then there is a long gap, and some, other places in Eastern Europe, right? Meaning that effectively most of these centers have been very much sort of focused on or dominated by Russianists and also, making sense of, for instance, Ukraine through Russia rather than from Ukraine itself, right? So in recognizing this post-colonial moment, it's also about sort of trying to acknowledge that, this moment is there for all these parties concerned in different ways, right? In a way, we are all post-colonial. Analytically, this is not perhaps very helpful. There is an active self-decolonization process that Ukraine is undergoing. There is an active, aggressive, barbarous recolonization attempt that Russia is pushing on Ukraine. And then there is this renewed understanding in the Eastern European region, again with its ebbs and flows, about we thought we have crossed certain prejudices, but then when things become awry again or a crisis hits, we again see these prejudices popping up. I mean, these conversations, every one of us, I guess, can cite many from our experiences, but some have been really shocking, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. So I think it's important to look into the eye of how politically not innocent the academic field that has studied these countries, this region, the interactions between these regions has been, how implicated it has actually been, and to actually acknowledge that this has also had a price, in the sense that, nobody really saw it coming. Nobody really could believe what was happening. And this is, in a way, the testament that, something was wrong or off in terms of how we were thinking about Russia and about the region as a whole. So the reason why I used this particular title was to build a connection to actually my own PhD supervisors, Tarak Barkavis and his co-authors, Mark Laffey's I believe, 2006 article, which was on the post-colonial moment in security studies, which addressed specifically this shock that was in security studies about how, something that would not even feature in the traditional security studies, as Al-Qaeda managed to hit into the heart of, the powerful United States at the time. So it was also about building this analog of, if we don't also take into consideration the perspectives of the weak ones or the little ones of international politics, then this will have not just, moral consequences, but also very concrete consequences empirically. We get things wrong and we somehow, fail in the sense of being able to understand as well as predict certain developments.
Maria, it was such an interesting conversation. Thank you very much for joining us and for your time.
Thank you so much, Viktorija, for having me.